The Dark Ages. A period that sends shivers down the spine of historians, evoking images of a world plunged into darkness and despair. This era followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a collapse that left a power vacuum and chaos in its wake. It was a time of great upheaval in Europe, marked by invasions, wars, and the fragmentation of territories. The name Dark Ages isn't just poetic, it signifies the literal and metaphorical darkness that enveloped the continent. It truly reflects the nature of this period where uncertainty and fear were constant companions. The Dark Ages were a time of widespread hardship. Knowledge was scarce and progress was painstakingly slow. Life was hard for almost everyone, with famine, disease, and poverty being rampant. The comforts and advancements of the Roman era were lost, leaving people to fend for themselves in a harsh new reality. Society had to rebuild from scratch, often with limited resources and knowledge. The term Dark Ages was coined by later scholars who looked back and saw a period of regression and stagnation. They saw this period as a step backward for humanity, a time when cultural and scientific advancements were few and far between. Let's dive in and see why you should be glad you weren't born in medieval times, a period that tested the resilience and endurance of those who lived through it. The Dark Ages saw the rise of the feudal system. This was a social structure that defined medieval life. At its core, feudalism was about hierarchy and control. It was a system that kept the rich powerful and the poor powerless. Imagine a pyramid. At the top, you have the king. Below him are the nobles, then the knights, and at the bottom, the vast majority, the peasants. This system was rigid and unfair. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. There was no social mobility, no chance to improve your lot in life. You were tied to the land you worked on. The feudal system was a social nightmare that defined the Dark Ages. The economy of the Dark Ages was a far cry from what we know today. It was primarily agrarian. This means most people were farmers. They produced just enough to survive. There was little surplus. Trade was limited, money was scarce. Most transactions were done through barter. Poverty was widespread. Most people lived hand to mouth. They had no savings, no safety net. A bad harvest could mean starvation. Natural disasters like floods or droughts were catastrophic. The economy of the Dark Ages was stagnant. It offered little hope for improvement or progress. Health in the Dark Ages was precarious at best. Medical knowledge was limited. Many believed in supernatural causes for diseases. Treatments were often ineffective or even harmful. Bloodletting, for example, was a common practice. Doctors believed it could cure almost anything. In reality, it often made patients weaker. Hygiene was poor. People rarely bathed. They believed it could make you sick. Streets were filled with garbage and human waste. This created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Rats and other vermin were everywhere. They carried fleas that spread deadly illnesses. Life expectancy was short. Health in the Dark Ages was a constant battle against overwhelming odds. Section 5. The plague death knocks on every door. The Black Death. These words still evoke terror today. In the Dark Ages, they meant unimaginable horror. The plague hit Europe in the 14th century. It killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Imagine 1 in 3 people you know dying. That was the reality of the plague. The disease spread quickly. People didn't understand how. They blamed everything from bad air to divine punishment. In reality, it was spread by fleas on rats. These rats were everywhere in the filthy medieval towns. The symptoms were horrifying: swollen, painful lymph nodes, high fever. Death often came within days. Section 6. Religious oppression and superstition. Religion dominated life in the Dark Ages. The church was all-powerful. It controlled not just spiritual matters, but political and social ones too. This power often led to oppression. The church could punish those it deemed heretics. This punishment could be severe. Torture and execution were not uncommon. Superstition was rampant. People believed in witches, demons, and evil spirits. These beliefs often led to tragedy. Innocent people were accused of witchcraft. They faced horrible fates. The church also controlled knowledge. The Dark Ages were a time when faith was often used as a tool of oppression. Section 7. The lack of scientific progress. The Dark Ages were a time of scientific stagnation. The great advances of the classical world were largely forgotten. The works of Greek and Roman scholars gathered dust. They were preserved in some monasteries but rarely studied or understood. The scientific method didn't exist. Observation and experimentation were not valued. Instead, people relied on ancient authorities. If Aristotle said something was true, it must be true. This blind acceptance of old ideas prevented progress. New discoveries were rare. When they did occur, they spread slowly. The printing press hadn't been invented yet. Books were hand-copied and expensive. The Dark Ages were truly dark when it came to scientific knowledge. Section 8. Warfare and violence in daily life. Violence was a constant threat in the Dark Ages. Wars were frequent. They were fought for land, power, or religious reasons. These wars affected everyone. Even if you weren't a soldier, you could be caught in the crossfire. Armies would pillage villages as they passed through. They'd take food, valuables, and sometimes people. But it wasn't just large-scale wars. Local violence was common too. Bandits roamed the countryside. They'd attack travelers and raid villages. Lords fought each other over land disputes. These feuds could last for generations. They'd drag entire communities into conflict. The Dark Ages were a time when might made right. Section 9. The harsh realities of medieval agriculture. Agriculture was the backbone of medieval society, but it was far from the idyllic rural life some might imagine. Farming in the Dark Ages was backbreaking work. It was also incredibly inefficient. Crop yields were low. A bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire community. Farmers had little understanding of soil management or crop rotation. The tools were primitive. Plows were made of wood. They couldn't dig deep into the soil. This limited what could be grown. Fertilizer was scarce. People didn't understand the science behind it. They relied on manure and other organic waste. Agriculture in the Dark Ages was a constant struggle against nature, ignorance, and bad luck. Section 10. Education and literacy, a privilege for the few. Education in the Dark Ages was a luxury few could afford. The vast majority of the population had no access to formal education. For most people, formal schooling didn't exist. Children learned by doing, often taking on responsibilities at a very young age. They worked alongside their parents from a young age, acquiring practical skills necessary for their future livelihoods. They learned the skills they'd need to survive, such as farming, blacksmithing, and sewing directly from their parents or community members. But they didn't learn to read or write. Literacy was not considered essential for their daily lives. They didn't study history or science. Their education was limited to what was immediately useful for their survival. Their world was small and limited, confined to their village and the surrounding fields. Literacy rates were extremely low. The ability to read and write was a rare skill, often reserved for the clergy and the nobility. Some estimates suggest that only 1 to 2% of the population could read. Even fewer could write. This small literate class held significant power. Books were rare and expensive. They were not mass-produced but meticulously hand-copied. They were hand-copied by monks in monasteries who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. This made them precious objects, often adorned with intricate illustrations and gold leaf. The Dark Ages were a time when knowledge was hoarded by a few. The scarcity of books and the low literacy rates meant that education and literacy were privileges for the elite. Section 11. Reflection. Why the Dark Ages were truly dark. As we look back on the Dark Ages, it's clear why this period earned its gloomy name. It was a time shrouded in hardship and struggle, a stark contrast to the advancements of other eras. Life was hard in ways we can scarcely imagine today. The daily existence of most people was a relentless battle for survival. The social structure trapped most people in poverty. Feudalism created a rigid hierarchy where the majority had little chance of improving their lot in life. The economy offered little hope for improvement. Health was precarious, with diseases and plagues sweeping through populations unchecked. Death was a constant companion. High mortality rates, especially among children, were a grim reality. Violence and war were ever-present threats. Conflicts between kingdoms and invasions were common, adding to the instability. But perhaps the greatest darkness was intellectual. The period saw a significant decline in cultural and scientific achievements. The lack of education and scientific progress held society back. Knowledge was scarce, and learning was often confined to monasteries. It kept people ignorant and superstitious. Superstition and fear of the unknown dominated the mindset of the time. It allowed oppression to flourish. Those in power used ignorance to maintain control over the masses. The church, while providing some stability, often stifled free thought. Religious dogma overshadowed scientific inquiry and philosophical debate. The great works of classical antiquity were largely forgotten. Much of the knowledge from ancient Greece and Rome was lost or ignored. As we reflect on this period, we should be grateful for how far we've come. The Renaissance and subsequent eras brought a revival of learning and progress, leading to the modern world we know today.